The sun hung low over the rolling fields, casting long golden streaks across the land as James Carter wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed his farm with quiet satisfaction. For years, he had worked tirelessly to turn this patch of land into something he could be proud of, something that honored his family's legacy and the generations of farmers who had come before him. His grandfather had once told him that the land had a soul, that it remembered every hand that had worked it, every drop of sweat that had fallen into its soil. James believed that with every fiber of his being. He had poured everything into this farm, his money, his energy, his heart, and it had rewarded him with a thriving business, one that not only sustained him but provided fresh, organic produce to the surrounding community. But not everyone saw the beauty in it. Ever since he had moved into the area, the Homeowners Association, led by none other than Linda Whitmore, a self-proclaimed protector of neighborhood standards, had made it clear that they saw his farm as an eyesore, an intrusion into their carefully curated world of manicured lawns and perfectly pruned hedges. The fact that his property had been there long before their cookie-cutter suburban developments didn't seem to matter to them. What mattered was that it didn't fit. And James? James had stopped trying to fit into spaces where he wasn't welcome a long time ago. He first noticed the white SUV creeping up his long gravel driveway just as he was finishing up his afternoon chores. The vehicle came to a slow stop near his barn, and out stepped Linda, her sharp heels sinking slightly into the soft earth as she marched forward with her usual air of entitlement. Her short, platinum blonde bob was perfectly styled, her pearl earrings glinting in the late afternoon sun. Behind her oversized designer sunglasses, he could almost feel the weight of her disapproving gaze. "James," she said curtly, arms crossed over her chest as she took in the sight of the barn, the wooden fences, the patches of wildflowers that bordered his vegetable garden. "We need to talk." James sighed inwardly but forced a neutral expression onto his face. "Linda," he greeted, dusting off his hands on his jeans. "What can I do for you today?" She pursed her lips as if merely breathing the same air as the farm was distasteful. "I've brought this issue up multiple times with the HOA, and quite frankly, I'm tired of repeating myself. Your operation here is becoming a problem. The smell, the noise, she gestured vaguely, as if at a loss for words, the general appearance of it. This is a residential community, James. This sort of thing doesn't belong here." James kept his expression calm, though irritation simmered beneath the surface. "Linda, with all due respect, this farm has been here for over 50 years. I legally own this land, and I run a fully licensed business. I'm not breaking any laws, and I'm certainly not going anywhere." Her lips thinned. "There are regulations, James. We have rules for a reason. Just this morning, I had complaints about your livestock. Chickens, was it? Roaming too close to the property lines." James exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay patient. "The chickens don't leave my land, Linda. They're fenced in. If someone's complaining, maybe they should stop feeding them scraps through the fence. That's what attracts them to the edge in the first place." Linda scoffed. "Regardless, it's unsightly. I can't have people coming to my home for dinner parties and seeing." She waved a manicured hand toward the barn, nose wrinkling. "Whatever this is in the background." James fought back a smirk. "Sounds like a personal problem, Linda." Her nostrils flared. "If you won't do something about it, I will." And with that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV, kicking up dust as she sped back toward the main road. James shook his head, already knowing this wouldn't be the last time she showed up with one of her ridiculous complaints. What he didn't expect, however, was the police showing up on his property the very next morning. 2 squad cars rolled up just as James was preparing to load a fresh shipment of produce into his truck for delivery. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped forward as one of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stocky build, stepped out of his vehicle. His name tag read Henderson. "Morning, sir," Henderson greeted, his tone professional but neutral. "We got a call about a potential zoning violation and some livestock disturbances coming from this property." James let out a slow breath. "Let me guess, Linda Whitmore?" The officer gave a slight nod. "A woman from the HOA, yes. She's claiming your farm is in violation of several community ordinances. We just need to verify that everything's in order." James gestured to his paperwork, already anticipating this. "All my licenses and permits are in that folder. Everything's legal. This farm has been here long before the HOA even existed." Henderson took the folder and flipped through it, nodding as he scanned the pages. His partner walked around the property, inspecting the fences, the livestock, and the general condition of the land. After a few minutes, he returned and gave a small shrug. "Everything looks good on our end," Henderson said, handing the papers back. "You're not in violation of anything." James allowed himself a small smile. "Appreciate that, officer." But just as the officers were about to leave, James caught sight of something. Movement near the edge of the property, close to where the dense tree line separated his land from the neighboring houses. Something about it felt off. A flicker of movement, something shifting between the branches. It wasn't an animal. James frowned. "Hey, hold up a second," he said, striding toward the trees, his boots crunching against the gravel. The officers exchanged glances but followed. As he moved closer, a chill crept up his spine. The movement wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone had been there, watching, and when he finally reached the trees, his breath caught. Hidden beneath the dense foliage was something he never expected to find. A makeshift campsite, a worn-out sleeping bag, empty cans of food, a child's jacket far too small for any grown adult. James turned back to the officers, a strange unease settling over him. "Looks like we might have a bigger problem than Linda Whitmore." James stood motionless for a moment, his pulse steady but his mind racing as he took in the sight before him. The makeshift campsite nestled within the dense tree line at the edge of his property was not something he had expected to find. And yet, here it was, a quiet testament to someone's struggle, their desperate attempt to remain unseen. The tattered sleeping bag, the rusted cans of food, and most of all, the small, faded jacket that seemed to whisper of a presence far more vulnerable than he had anticipated. A child. He turned back to Officer Henderson, who was already making his way toward the site, his partner close behind. Henderson's brow furrowed as he took in the scattered belongings, his professional demeanor shifting slightly. "Looks like someone's been living out here," he muttered, crouching down to examine the ground. "And not just anyone. A kid." James exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering back toward the farmhouse. Had they been watching him all this time? How long had they been here, surviving on whatever scraps they could find? And more importantly, why? The thought sat heavy in his chest, a weight that pressed against his ribs with every beat of his heart. Officer Henderson straightened, glancing back toward his partner. "We'll need to check missing persons reports, see if anyone's been reported in the area." James nodded, still deep in thought. "I've been out here almost every day working the fields, tending to the animals. I never noticed anything. Whoever they are, they've been careful." Henderson surveyed the site again, his lips pressed into a firm line. "Desperation makes people careful," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Before James could respond, the unmistakable sound of an approaching vehicle shattered the moment. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The sharp crunch of tires on gravel, the aggressive way the car came to a halt, the clipped, impatient sound of heels clicking against the earth. Linda Whitmore. She arrived like a storm, stepping out of her pristine white SUV with an air of righteous indignation. Her sunglasses were perched atop her head now, revealing eyes that burned with the kind of entitlement James had grown all too familiar with. "Officer," she called, striding toward them as though she were the one in charge. "I assume you're handling the situation?" Henderson turned toward her, visibly restraining a sigh. "What situation would that be, ma'am?" Linda scoffed, gesturing around as if the very presence of James's farm was an insult. "This," she snapped. "I called about this entire mess. The smell, the noise, the blatant disregard for HOA regulations. I expect something to be done about it." James felt his hands clench at his sides, but he forced himself to remain composed. He had no intention of giving her the reaction she was looking for. Henderson, to his credit, did not seem impressed. "Ma'am, we've already checked Mr. Carter's paperwork. Everything here is legal and in order." Linda's lips thinned. "That can't be right," she said, shaking her head. "This farm is a nuisance. It brings down property values. It provides food for half the town," James interjected calmly, his voice level but firm. "Fresh, organic produce, eggs, dairy. You think the farmer's market just stocks itself?" Linda ignored him, her focus still on the officers. "I pay too much in HOA fees to have to deal with this eyesore," she continued. "If he won't leave, then he needs to be shut down." James could feel the heat rising in his chest now, but it wasn't until Linda took another step forward, closer to the tree line, that everything shifted. Her expression twisted in disgust as her eyes landed on the campsite, on the remnants of someone's desperate existence hidden just beyond the fence. "What is that?" she demanded. James saw the shift in the officers before he even turned to face them. The professional detachment they had maintained was replaced with something sharper. Something that suggested the situation had just taken on a new level of importance. Henderson's partner, a younger officer who had remained mostly silent until now, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave the scene. This is now an active investigation." Linda blinked. "Investigation? Into what?" James finally turned to her, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made even her hesitate. "Someone's been living out here, Linda. A child." For the first time since she had arrived, Linda seemed genuinely thrown off balance. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "Well," she said after a long pause, "that's not my problem, is it?" The words hit James like a slap, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed everything he had already known about her. "No," he said quietly, shaking his head. "It never is." Linda scoffed, as if his reaction was an overreaction. "Look, I don't know why you're making this into some kind of moral crusade," she said. "If there is a homeless person, or whatever this is, on your property, that's your responsibility, not mine. Maybe if you weren't so focused on playing farmer, you'd notice what's happening under your nose." James clenched his jaw, but before he could say anything, Officer Henderson took a step forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. We need to do our job." Linda bristled at the dismissal. "I will be filing a complaint," she said sharply. "Mark my words, this isn't over." She turned on her heel and stalked back to her SUV, slamming the door shut and speeding off down the gravel road. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. James exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "She won't let this go," he muttered. Henderson nodded, but his focus remained on the campsite. "Probably not," he admitted. Then, after a pause, he added, "But that's not our priority right now. Finding out who this child is, that's what matters." James looked back at the remnants of the life that had been hiding in the shadows of his farm, and for the first time since discovering it, he felt something settle deep in his bones. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to ignore it. James watched as Officer Henderson and his partner methodically combed through the makeshift campsite, their flashlights illuminating small details that made the reality of the situation even more unsettling. The tiny footprint in the dirt, the carefully arranged cans of food that suggested someone had been rationing their meals, the remnants of a stuffed animal peeking out from beneath a threadbare blanket. Every new discovery only reinforced the same chilling question. Who was this child, and what were they running from? James had always prided himself on noticing things, on reading between the lines, on understanding the quiet rhythms of life around him. And yet, somehow he had missed this. Someone desperate, alone, hiding in the shadows of his own land. The weight of it pressed against his chest like an unseen hand, tightening with every breath. As the officers continued their search, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made James turn sharply. It was subtle, barely more than a shift in the darkness beyond the tree line, but he knew he had seen it. His pulse quickened, his body tensing as his eyes adjusted. And then, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beams, he saw her, A girl. She was small, her frame barely more than a silhouette against the dense trees. But there was no mistaking the way she stood, rigid, poised to flee, her fingers curled around the bark of a tree as if bracing herself. Even from this distance, James could see the raw fear in her stance, the way she seemed to shrink into herself as if she had spent too long trying to disappear. Before he could react, Officer Henderson turned, following James's line of sight. "Stay where you are," he called, but the girl flinched and bolted. James didn't think, he just moved. His boots pounded against the earth as he took off after her, his breath sharp in his chest. He wasn't as fast as he used to be, but he didn't need to be. The girl was small, her legs too short to cover ground quickly, and she was running blindly, stumbling over roots and uneven patches of dirt. "Wait!" he called, his voice steady but urgent. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't stop. James pushed forward, his heart hammering as he reached out. And then, just as she tried to swerve to the side, she lost her footing. With a startled cry, she tumbled to the ground, scraping her hands and knees against the rough terrain. James skidded to a halt, hands raised in a show of peace. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl scrambled back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her clothes were filthy, her hair a tangled mess, and up close, she looked even younger than he had imagined. No older than 8 or 9. Her eyes, wide and wild, darted between him and the approaching officers, panic radiating from every part of her small frame. Officer Henderson slowed his steps, his tone calm but firm. "We just want to help you, sweetheart. Can you tell us your name?" The girl didn't answer. Her fingers dug into the dirt, her entire body coiled like a trapped animal. James knelt down slowly, careful not to startle her further. "You've been staying out here, haven't you?" he asked gently. "Living on your own?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, barely above a whisper, she muttered, "I didn't steal nothing." James's chest tightened. "I know," he said. "Nobody's accusing you of anything." She swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to the officers again. "You're gonna take me away," she whispered. Henderson hesitated. "We just need to know where you came from," he said. "If someone is looking for you." At that, her expression changed, her eyes darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No one's looking for me," she said, her voice hollow. James felt something inside him twist. He didn't know what this girl had been through, but he knew that tone. He had heard it before, in the voices of people who had spent too long believing they were invisible. He glanced at Henderson, who seemed to understand without words. The officer sighed, pulling out his radio. "We'll need child services out here," he muttered. The girl's breath hitched. "No," she said, shaking her head violently. "No, I'm not going with them." She tried to push herself up, but her scraped knee buckled beneath her, and James instinctively reached out to steady her. She flinched at first, but when he didn't tighten his grip, when he didn't force her to move, she hesitated. "You're hurt," he said simply. "Let me help you." Her small hands trembled, her entire body tense. But after a long, agonizing moment, she gave the smallest nod. James exhaled, only now realizing how tightly his own hands had curled into fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. John stood silently as the officers led Karen away, her protests growing more frantic with each passing second. She twisted in their grip, her voice rising in desperation, demanding that someone listen, that someone believe her. But the weight of truth had already settled over the gathered crowd, and the more she struggled, the clearer it became. No one was coming to her defense. John had seen it before, the moment when the powerful, the entitled, those who had spent their lives bending the rules to their advantage, finally realized that the ground beneath them had vanished. Karen had wielded her authority like a weapon, had called the police with the arrogance of someone who had never once considered that the system she relied on might turn against her. And yet, here she was, wrists bound, eyes wild with disbelief, as the very officers she had summoned carried out her arrest. Catching his gaze, she lunged forward as far as the officers would allow, her expression twisting from shock into fury. "You did this," she spat. "You think this is funny? You think you've won?" John didn't flinch. He simply let the silence stretch between them, unbothered by her outburst. Karen had spent her life shouting people into submission, but he wasn't someone who could be bullied. Kensat Truong Ray, standing nearby with his arms crossed, let out a slow sigh and shook his head. "People always think they're untouchable," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something like pity. "Until they're not." The town had gathered by now, the story spreading like wildfire through the small community. Some watched in stunned silence, others whispered among themselves, and a few openly smirked at the irony of it all. Karen, who had spent so much time looking down on others, now found herself on the receiving end of the very scrutiny she had once so freely doled out. As the officers loaded her into the back of the squad car, John finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. "You should have just let me mow my damn lawn." The door slammed shut. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, low and knowing. The tension that had weighed on the farm for weeks seemed to dissipate all at once, replaced by something lighter, relief, maybe even a touch of justice. John exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the last remnants of the encounter. He had never set out to teach Karen a lesson, had never wanted anything more than to be left alone to tend to his land. But life had a way of balancing itself out. Sometimes karma didn't need any help at all. He turned back to his tractor, the hum of its engine still warm from where he'd left it. There was work to be done, grass to be cut, a life to be lived beyond the drama of one woman's misguided sense of superiority. He didn't need to celebrate or gloat. The world had a way of sorting things out on its own. And with that, John climbed back onto his seat, pushed the lever forward, and let the familiar rhythm of his work drown out the last echoes of Karen's protests. Justice had been served, and the farm, his farm, remained exactly as it should be, his. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more incredible stories to life. What do you think about karma catching up with Karen? Let us know in the comments.